And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the fourth webinar hosted by the Review of Political Economy. This one in particular is hosted also by the International Journal of Political Economy, whose director is Matias, Seccareccia, one of the guest speakers this morning. Now, while many of you may remember, the first ROPE webinar that we did a month and a half ago was on the economic impact of COVID. This time we return to the crisis, but yet with another question. What are the policies for prosperity? And in fact, how do we go from COVID depression to sustained economic growth? We have four speakers: Tom Ferguson from INET, Matias Seccareccia from the University of Ottawa. We have Matias Vernengo from Bucknell University, and as well, the editor of the Review of Keynesian Economics. And finally, we have Anna Maria Variato from the University of Bergamo. One small caveat, during the original recording of this webinar, we were bombed, and as a consequence, they were able to shut down the recording of the webinar. So this introduction is re-recorded, and as well, we lost about 20 minutes of the webinar, which means the first speaker, Tom Ferguson, we don't have a recording of his talk, and I do apologize to the speaker and to you as well. With that in mind, we will join the webinar in progress with Matias Seccareccia. Thank you.
In fact, it's been over 40 years at least that I've been arguing that one important element to stabilize an economy, regardless of how bad it is in a sense, or how deep are the fluctuations here, what is needed is a long-term plan for public investment that would be broadly complementary in a sense with private sector investment. And this, of course, is for several reasons. One, it would become an anchor for private sector investment. Private and public sector investment, as I argue, tend to be complementary in reality. Secondly, a large public investment program would have consequences of the sort of Keynesian uncertainty that is plaguing the world economy today, by becoming a make-weight program looking towards, I would argue, a brighter future that only government has the capacity to fund and be sufficiently credit-worthy, quote unquote, if you want to use such a vocabulary, to pursue it. Thirdly, it would not necessarily be associated with crony capitalism, as is often the case with especially public-private type partnerships and all that. And four, it would be critical to the enhancing of long-term productivity growth that accompanies it, and it has done so historically. More than ever in the current context of a public investment project financed perhaps through a special public investment bank, as I said, they should use QE for that purpose. Finance, as I said, through this means would be important and would remain permanently in place to signal a shift in investment priority towards public assets of both a physical and non-physical type. During the pandemic, for instance, here in Canada, there were many deficiencies in, say, healthcare requiring much needed public investment, but especially in the critical area of senior long-term care, where new facilities are desperately needed. But the same applies in the area of human capital funding, such as education, which is so important for future long-term growth. And moreover, there ought to be a return to Keynes's, what we could call, long-term program of socializing investment. But perhaps most importantly, I would argue, there's the whole area of climate change and the environment that needs to be addressed big times, as we've seen with all the proposals for a Green New Deal in the US and even here in Canada. And hence, only through that means can we achieve something that would have this recovery that will be quicker. It's going to take time. I think Steve was saying, well, clearly, even any kind of public investment, you got to think in the long term here. But this is exactly the point. We need an anchor for the economy. A second area that I would like to, if I'm permitted here, a second area here that I would like to emphasize, because I've worked on this stuff over many years again, okay, has to do with this whole issue of guaranteed income. And here, do we need a kind of post-pandemic change in social policy in favor of some form of guaranteed income? Now, here I would like to take a kind of historical perspective on this whole issue. Indeed, ever since human society evolved, human production and human consumption, in a sense, was tied to work effort. But it was necessary, of course, to share the fruits of that work effort with various members of a society, of a community, regardless of whether they were directly involved in the production effort or not. Now, while there was a natural sharing of this production with members of one's household or tribe or community, there was the compulsory sharing of this production through coercion, as in the payment, let's say, feudal rent or whatever. And as Marx so correctly noted it, this institutional extraction exists under capitalism through the emergence of a capitalist labor market, again through the voluntary or compulsory sharing of production arising from that work effort. Now, by the 19th century already, but even more so during the 20th century, with the rise of a so-called welfare state, there appeared a formal institutional separation between work effort and income provision in a way that had not existed in human civilization before. Now, a number of advocates of guaranteed income have been promoting the view that the COVID-19 pandemic justifies a universal basic income as never before in human history, with this institutional separation, of work and income. As I have been saying literally since the mid-1980s, a guaranteed income that applies universally and that is not merely a patchwork of policies as they exist today, for instance, is a step forward in terms of social provisioning that would have been preferred to what we have in place. As even now with this patchwork of policies during the pandemic, where we're kind of filling holes everywhere, it would have been a lot easier to just simply implement some kind of COVID-style guaranteed income. And as, for example, could have been done here in Canada, because obviously here as I said, because of the patchwork of policies, a worker had to apply for different programs depending on his or her particular status as an unemployed, a self-employed, a student, a pensioner, etc., etc. And obviously, many fell through the cracks, I'm sure. A universal basic income would have been preferred for sure. However, the adoption of a guaranteed income in the context of an economy where mass unemployment is and will be the norm for a good while, can only exacerbate the situation for workers seeking employment at the low end of the wage scale. In fact, we saw that already with the current kind of income support, how that led to some problems in terms of wage deflation. Now, a low guaranteed income can only generate wage deflation in the context of an economy with a chronically high unemployment as the norm. I mean, even Polanyi talks about this in the context of the 19th century. And this is why I've argued here that what is needed is not only a commitment to a kind of full income, but what is needed also is a commitment to full employment at the same time here. A guaranteed income in the absence of full employment can only generate problems of market wage deflation, as was being witnessed literally even during the pandemic. And hence, what we have is a long-term plan here. Now, I would argue it's a kind of two-step or twofold or two-handed approach here, where on the one hand, you want a process of socializing investment through public capital accumulation and all that, that would establish a norm of growth for the long term, with rising productivity and so on, but also that there should be a social safety net in place that ought to include both a universal basic income, but also a job guarantee program as complementary measures that remain in place over time. If these are put in place, we could have a much more civilized human, society here. I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Mario. We can take a few questions now. If you do have a question, please unmute yourself and do ask.
Hey, LP, I have a question.
Who's speaking?
This is David Fields.
David Fields, okay.
Yeah. Mario, would you differentiate between a universal basic income and a guaranteed income, or would you consider them as one and the same?
Well, they're not the same. They're not exactly the same, but the consequences aren't that different. Who are here right now, they edited a book where I wrote a chapter on exactly that issue. And even Tom knows about it because I presented it originally at INET in 2017 in Edinburgh, which is that whether you refer to the the guaranteed annual income type, with a negative income tax, that's one form, a la Friedman and so on. That's the kind of model. In fact, here in Canada, in Ontario here, they had introduced an initial kind of program, study, experiment, whatever they called it then, which was canceled by our current conservative government, but it was introduced under the Liberals in 2017. It was pretty much analogous to the negative income tax. They literally used some of the same figures, which had a 50% tax back rate and so on. So there's the one, which is the tax back rate, meaning that you're able to retain, employment income at some rate. Okay? And also, of course, there's a guaranteed minimum. Now, in the case of a universal basic income, the only difference is that you're going to give everybody that minimum, let's say $2,000 a month type of thing, as they were suggesting here in Canada, for instance. And then it's going to be taxed, according to the rules of tax, whatever you have in terms of tax structure in that country, in terms of progressive income tax. But the effects, what I was trying to show in the paper, and I would be happy to send it to you if you're interested.
Oh, please, I would like to. Thank you.
What I was trying to show was that in both cases, it gives you negative consequences, because what is most critical is the actual basic income that is going to be adopted. And I tell you right now, obviously, if here in Canada, we paid everybody $100,000 a year, then all of the kind of disincentive effects that some of our neoclassical friends would suggest may turn out to be the case, at that level. However, what we have often seen, if you look at the type of, for instance, the Ontario plan here, just to give an example, I had calculated at the time that it was approximately equal to 65% of the minimum wage income would get normally. So it's right at the poverty line kind of thing. And so that will create incentive for people to take up jobs and low-wage jobs. That's the whole logic. I mean, Milton Friedman was proposing a guaranteed income not to get people to stay on welfare, but to get them off welfare. Okay? And,
like a reservation wage?
I'm sorry?
Like a reservation wage.
Well, exactly. I mean, but so no, but more than that, because what's happening is that you're always going to be better off if you have a very low income to pick up another job that would be what I would call, you know, measly cheap labor kind of job out there, because what will happen, it will be an add-on. Now, it could be either taxed at some rate or fully, whatever it is, but it will be an add-on that will encourage you to want to take up those jobs.
Yeah.
Okay, and that is the problem, because what it leads is to a kind of market polarization of wages on the low end.
Yeah. Thank you, Mario. Just for
thank you.
Just for a point, the program in Canada called CERB that gives $2,000 a month comes up to approximately minimum wage.
Yes.
Pretty much.
Yes, that's the current one, and it allows you to actually keep some income, extra income that should not exceed a certain limit.
Yeah. Mario,
I can't remember what it is exactly.
Mario, just wanted to say that you're frozen.
But I can.
And you do seem to have a connection problem out to your end. Sometimes.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Maybe one more question.
Louis?
Yes. Who's
Omar?
speaking? Huh?
Omar.
Omar. Okay.
Omar,
yeah.
Can you hear me?
We can. Yes.
You can hear me. Yeah. I think so far most of what has been said are just general observations. I think Mario, touched on some critical things, but it just lost me at the end. Thomas, I don't think has much substance in what he has so far. I'm sure he has written elsewhere. I'm just talking about what he has said today. So what I can probably get from his talk, the first one, is he was saying that we cannot let capital do what he wants. Unfortunately, I would like to know what this capital is and what is the blueprint and what is the theory that can take us out of this mess. Mario also, the only thing we can summarize from what he says is how can we get a long-term plan for investment, and how can you get this economy started? And I think everything turns in terms of capital, and capital as finance. And I think that's where probably we should put our thinking and explain what is finance and how does it work, how we can get a growth out of that. In the first crisis of 2008, the monetary authority jumped in, and the first things they want to do is bail the financial institutions. Most of the money was directed to them. Unfortunately, we are in different circumstances, and we're doing exactly the same thing. The governments are intervening in trying to save the financial market. As a part-time farmer and as a part-time baker, as you can see, just been baked a minute ago, at the beginning of the COVID, we've been contacted and the government told us, yeah, we have money, we can help you. It took 2 days to get $40,000 grant for the bakery and $40,000 for the farm. And we've been told that keep paying your workers, but send them home. How are you going to produce? By sending people home and keeping working. The money didn't come to us from the government directly. It came through the bank. And the banks told us, you have these loans, you can spend them, keep paying, you have 6 months to start reimbursing. So I think this idea that the governments are generous in giving money to the people to stay home just for the sake of, helping people, I think maybe it's an illusion. The money is there to sustain the financial system. And I think if we do not redirect our thinking, I think you did probably, Mario, you did point out in that direction, the socialization of investment has to do with what money is. And what Keynes was thinking is the money should not be in the hand of the banking system. It can be in the hands of the banking system as long as the banking system is regulated and as long as we can direct that investment in the way that it can produce value added and not used for speculation and make the financial institution, which their interest is not really the production of the economy. Their interest is to sustain the rent economy, and that's what it is. So I would like to have a little bit your opinion, both as far as Thomas and you, Mario, as just the remarks that I just made. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Tom, do you want to go first?
No, I'd like actually to think for 5 seconds, but so let Mario sort of start it off if he would.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm very happy to address your questions here. First of all, I want to perhaps correct you on something, which is that it's true that the Canadian government was, the federal government was providing a lot of credit, advances to businesses to maintain them aloof and to get them to hold their workforce even. But it's also true that they were paying something like up to 3/4 of their salaries, of workers during that whole process. So it's what the business would have to pay is the other 1/4, whatever you want to call it here, and a lot of that is in the form of that payments for for Social Security, kind of all these other things that were part of the labor costs there. So I think it's there was a lot of going on that was in the form of transfers, not just in the form of advances. But it is true, especially for corporations. In fact, the most recent one that came out in May, I can't remember when it was, which was for big corporations like General Motors kind of thing. They would also be funding them by providing credit in this case. Okay, so there was but in terms of the issue that you raise here, which is that it's the problem of finance. Well, that's exactly the point I was making at the when I said that when you look at the way in which governments, at least on this continent, and I think generally speaking, have behaved, their main focus was the financial sector. And in particular, central banks being almost like the executive committee or whatever you want to call of the rentier sector, where you want to make, what they were doing is providing huge the liquidity here to maintain low asset prices, okay? Which of course means whatever they are, it could be asset-backed securities, you name it. They're buying up all kinds of stuff there, including treasuries, of course, in the case of the US, for instance, or even here in Canada, the same thing. And it was huge amounts, many times that of what they were doing on the fiscal side. And you would wonder why that is happening. Okay? So it's obvious here that I agree with you. The problem is on the finance side. And this is why I was saying what they should be doing instead is attempt to, obviously you don't want to see banks go under necessarily, but what you may want to do is buy them up and then sell them later if that is, what you want to do with them. That's what they should have done after the global financial crisis, instead of, providing them support and then each of them even giving themselves bonuses, on the side there, as a way to thank the government for the great work they did in helping them. That is, I completely agree on that level. That is the problem here. And this is why I'm saying we should shift emphasis away from that and tie that financing that could come by setting up a fund, building up a bank, whatever you want to call it, some kind of thing there that would guarantee in the long term that you will have public investment projects that would be lined up and that would continue over time in all kinds of much needed areas. There's no lack of that need. That's the reality, especially when it comes to issues of climate and issues of, to do with the environment.
Thank you, Mario. Tom, do you have anything to add?
Well, all right, just very briefly, it's clear that every major country made a decision at the start of the crisis that they didn't want to do a sort of war economy model of of how to proceed. That is to say, where the government would really step in. There were a lot of calls for that, both in Europe and a lot in the United States too. It hasn't really happened anywhere. It's clear that the sort of subtext of virtually every state's intervention and also the multilateral associations like the European Union or something like that, they're not going to go that route. In the case of the US Fed, they put a ton of money out, as you know. Now, they said at the time in the legislation that, I mean, the Fed just did it. Unlike other things governments did, they just went ahead again, and just like they had in 2008. In the case of the various fiscal policy measures like the US government did, they all began by saying they were going to try to preserve jobs. Then you look at the programs, and look, you don't get however many million unemployed they've got now in the midst of all this lending by anybody making a serious effort to preserve jobs. I mean, the big business program, they had programs that were formally targeted for big business in the US. Those, everybody admits, they just gave them the cash, especially the second tranche when they, a little later, where the Secretary of the Treasury, when he was reproached for it, actually said, well, we all agreed this round wouldn't actually be on workers at all, or wouldn't be targeted on employment. They, anyway, so, and in the small business programs, which were supposed to target employment, didn't. It turned out that they were handed out to banks, which then passed them out to their customers. So you've obviously, I mean, my reading of the US case, but also in Europe, it's a little weird. It turns out, like, the German government made a big pitch on how it was going to try to preserve employment. But then it turned out that, well, they preserved only some of that in that Kurzarbeit scheme. And then it turned out that the firms were allowed to top up especially their higher income employees. And you can discover this only when you look at the German public opinion polls. Somebody took one in Thuringia, where the history of Germany is, if a lot of bad things start, they often start in Thuringia. And then it came out, that's where it was in that analysis where I saw for the first time that, well, there was the other firm-centered interventions for salaries. So I agree with Mario generally all the time, and yeah, these guys need a lot more social control. It's clear the banks just passed out their small business loans, which they were the vehicles of, to their favorite clients on whatever basis. And so the whole thing is ridiculous in my judgment. Yeah.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, we'll move to the third speaker. There's been a little slight change in the order. Matias is teaching at 1 o'clock, I believe. So with Anna Maria's permission, Matias will speak next, and then we'll end with Anna Maria. Okay, Matias, you've got about 15 minutes, 20.
Sounds good. I apologize for disrupting the order, and I want to thank Louis-Philippe and the other participants. I'm gonna, sort of show briefly, given that I prepared the. Nope, that's not the one I wanted to show. Let me stop this for a second and see where I have it.
It did say webinar on it, though.
Well, I think it wasn't the. So let's see if now it works. Just a sec. So I guess now you can see the PowerPoint. One of the things of being, in this case, the third. So I'm not. Ana Maria will have more trouble than I do, in a sense, is that a lot of the stuff has been already said, and I gave 2 talks on this before, one in Spanish, but one actually for YSI, and I net the Young Scholar Initiative, and some of the stuff I'm going to say here, it's related to what I said before, so some of you might have seen some of what I'm going to say, and on top it repeats a little bit of, but my thinking has evolved a little bit, so perhaps there is something interesting to be said on these issues, and and I don't have that much time, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what kind of a crisis this is. And hence what type of recovery one might have, coming from this, and very briefly talk about the policies pursued. To the extent that I can, I'm gonna say a few things that that might be slightly different from what Tom and Mario had said before, and then I'll have some conclusions which go to the heart of I think the question that Omar raised and that Mario and Tom were responding right now. So the important thing, so there was a whole discussion at the beginning of this, is this was a supply side shock or a demand shock, and to my reading of this, of the literature on this, it's interesting enough that vast majority actually of the people discussing this tend to think that this is a supply shock and that it disrupts supply chains and chains and so on and so forth. So if you go to popular mainstream sort of websites and whatnot, you'll see discussions at Vox and stuff like that. They'll have discussions essentially of supply sort of disruptions as being central, and of course some of those, I should say, I have back there my connection to my blog. I wrote to this on the blog. It was published in a newspaper in Spanish. So, but you have the link on the blog, Naked Keynesianism, in English. Of course there are supply sort of supply disruptions, but the vast majority of in my view, of the recession is associated to a significant demand shock, and that demand shock is concentrated on the service sector. So Gabriel Matthew from American University wrote an interesting sort of blog post on this, which was cited by the New York Times, by the way. And when you look at the data, you can see that now we're talking, so 45% of GDP is, or about there, it's the service sector, and so all of a sudden a sector that, as he notes, was acyclical. So nobody stopped cutting their hair during a recession. So nobody furloughed barbers. So all of a sudden this is an issue. So Louis-Philippe is used to cut his own hair. I'm new to this, and so. So that's certainly, it's something new, and the important thing of this is that it's been hit very strongly. And when you look at the number, this is some data that was shown in a New York Times sort of piece on this. You see that the cut in services, it's by far, sort of large. It's a huge sort of dip, of course. And you see the opening sort of happening there and whatnot, but it's bigger, significantly larger by the wealthier groups that, of course, are the ones, if we're talking about all the issues already raised, that people that don't have enough income and the systems to reach them are imperfect, that need to work. So those wealthier people that don't need to work can cut more, stay at home more, spend less on a bunch of things that they used to do. And so also it's important to note, as the New York Times, they're citing research by Ralph Chetty, that as income inequality went up, and that's one of the structural characteristics of not just the American economy, but of the global economy. So even when you go to China and India and whatnot, income inequality within country has sort of increased. One of the things that comes from that is that we'll have further, the higher income groups have a more preponderant role, in consumption as a result of this, and so this sort of downturn that affects, the wealthier consumption will have more of an impact that it would have had in previous recessions. So that's something to bear in mind in the kind of recession that we're getting. So trying to rush through some of these things so I can talk about some of the other stuff. So then the second sort of issue, which I think it's relevant, it's what type of recovery we're going to get. And of course, at the beginning, as much as there was a discussion between supply and demand, and most people were supply and still suggest that supply is the fundamental thing. And perhaps that explains to some extent why there hasn't been a more war economy planning sort of perspective from most governments, because there is a notion that associated to this, that the recovery will. So I forgot to say. So most people still believe that the recovery will be, I think, pretty fast. I'm surprisingly so. So. And perhaps because of that, there is this notion that simple patch-up measures for a few months might be okay, and they require people to repay their loans in 6 months, and so on and so forth. So everything so far, and I think the question there is the so far is associated to this notion that things are going to be relatively fast-paced in the recovery, that we're opening up, and now we're going to get back to business as usual. And if you look there, so this is I don't know. I suppose you can see my little arrow there, but so this is obviously the current, the COVID, the great shutdown, the great lockdown, whatever you want to call it. You see there that there is a little spike here from April to May, and the data shows there. And while it's true that a lot of the discussion showed that the numbers are obviously miscounted, I should say all of those numbers were miscounted in the previous month too. So whatever happened in both data series. There, in both points here, you have the same kind of miscounting done by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so it seems that the 2 million jobs were created in the numbers are all humongous, and sort of surprising. And of course, if you look at, and by the way, so I put there a quote from the Washington Post from Mark Zandi, which is from this month. And Mark Zandi, I mean, many of you may know him, but he's at Moody's.com and has been has written with Alan Blinder. He's one of the sort of prime broadcast forecasters in the United States. So he this phrase is from this month. The COVID recession will go down as the shortest and arguably the most severe in history. So the severity is not discussed because the numbers are already there. Unemployment went to 14%. If you count use 6, it's at more than 20%. So the numbers are truly of biblical proportions. So this is numbers of the Great Depression, numbers that I think most of us thought that we would never see. But you can imagine, surely enough, you can imagine some sort of recovery that it's sort of fast-paced, like this is World War II. So I put only 3 others to give you examples. World War II, in which as Mario suggested, that the reasons for a relatively fast recovery. But by the way, relatively fast is it's about 2 years. It's slightly less. It's 19 months or so. You have the Reagan recession, and you have here the Great Recession. So the 2007, 2009 sort of recession, and you see how long it took for the economy to reach back the same level of employment. And that was more than 6 years to do the whole job. So all of this, to set the stage to what I think one more reasonably can think about this. And so the issue in all of this discussion is that, there is that famous phrase from John Kenneth Galbraith, that says that the only reason for economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable. And I think that should be revised to suggest something similar about epidemiology. So it seems like the forecasts are all over the place, and of course those are central to any discussion of what might happen in the economy. So I've been playing around. If you go to the blog, that's why I actually put there. I played around a little bit with some ideas of what might happen. But I suggested, I worked for 2 years for Wynne Godley at the Levy Institute. The way I see these kinds of simulations are not about forecasting, so I'm not predicting things that I think might happen. I'm not going to show you those. I'm going to say a few things. I'm reworking on some of these things with Suranjana Nabarbaduri, which I think it's here somewhere. And the point of what Wynn's sort of way of thinking about this was showing some structural characteristics of the way the system works, and that the results that he showed were to some extent implicit in the causal structure of the model. So causality here, and the structure of the model implies certain things. So I think, what I do take as, from this discussion is that even with all of this uncertainty associated to how many people will eventually get it and how many people will eventually die, and when do we have a second wave and how strong that second wave is, and so on and so forth, I think it's reasonable to assume that we're going to have more than one wave, that these waves will take some time to pass, that the vaccine, even if it comes, it's not an immediate thing. And one may think even that this may become endemic, so that we are here, COVID is here to stay. And if all of those things are true, then not just the human cost, which that's obviously the case, the economic costs will be sort of significant. And, I'll suggest, I didn't write that down here, but, you need only a few things in the causal structure to get to some predictions. One is the principle of effective demand. So if you do have some simple story by which output is, determined, output and employment are determined by autonomous spending, then you end up that, this significant collapse of consumption, partly, offset by increases in government spending. The added sort of things that we might have from the international economy, because as Mario noted, there are already trade wars and a slowdown of international trade that was in course before the pandemic, and can only be made worse by all of those things. And you add some simple rules, so to the multiplier story, to effective demand story, you add an Okun's law of some sort. And the amount of time then that and how much growth of GDP you need to bring down unemployment. Remember, Okun is you grow 3% above your normal growth, you reduce unemployment by 1%, and you can play around with different numbers on that. So my point is, again, it's the causality structure that matters to me. And some simple rules then for stock flow relations, so that fiscal deficits accumulate into debt. The story is that that will explode, and it will probably get to close to Italian, European, or Japanese levels in the U.S. It's already above 100%. Remember, it went from 60 to about 100. I'm not complaining. I have no trouble with that. So my point here is the point brought up by Mario, emphasized by Louis-Philippe, that we will have the discourse of austerians pretty soon, because that will happen. It's kind of inevitable. And by the way, if unemployment, remains, at these levels that we have right now, it will take about 7-8 years to bring down unemployment to, again, reasonably low one-digit levels. And so closer to something that we may call full employment, even if we know that what we had wasn't full employment and whatnot. And so that's one thing. On the monetary side, I want to say that, here you have the balance sheet. You see that already, the balance sheet of the Fed sort of increased significantly. So there are many complaints, and you guys raised many of those about the way the rescues are being done, the bailouts. Although on this, I should say that I think some form of bailout is necessary. So I'll always quote the example of Sweden in the early 90s, in which they nationalized banks as a way of dealing with some of the sort of effects of this. And I should say also regarding what happened in 2008, in the United States, that we would need, although I doubt that we would have that with either a new, a Trump administration or a new Biden administration, that they should prosecute people that evidently did things that are inappropriate. And I should say there are still lots of dead bodies in the closet. So there is a piece, I should say, that I recommend if you guys haven't read on Atlantic by Frank Portnoy, on collateralized loan obligations, CLOs, and the dimensions of this, which approach $1 trillion, and how many of the big banks in the United States are filled with these instruments, and how much of a danger this poses for the stability of the system. And so the globally systematically important banks are again on the hook, and there is a possibility of a crisis. All of this to say that we barely began with the crisis, and the numbers already look sort of problematic. And I think that the things to come will sort of still make everything much worse on the human side. The human cost of this, because if we don't get a vaccine, and if we do the things that Tom was suggesting about opening up universities, businesses, restaurants, and whatnot, we will get to the point in which something like 80% of the population will be infected, and we'll have in the United States alone something close to 2 million deaths. We're still at 120,000, and I should say on this, the United States, very much like developing countries, is unprepared. So the United States in many ways looks like a developing country in the way it deals with those issues, even though we've seen stuff and stories now popping up about India and Latin America and so on and so forth. So I think we're going to see those things too. But the economic dimension, it's still to come. So I'm not sure we're already done with how we're going to cope with the crisis. So I think that the crisis is still unfolding, and will unfold for a while. And the full range of what we'll have to do is still not on the table. So that's my sort of sense on that. So some concluding thoughts, which should be the sort of focus of this. And I might even stop sharing this, because I'm going to talk about this stuff, and so I can see the faces, which I suppose it makes more sense. So what else can be done about those things? And Louis-Philippe, I suppose I'm getting close to my time, so I'm going to have a couple of minutes to talk about this. So some of these were sort of suggested. I did write early on, so that's one of the early on that I said that if and it was there in the PowerPoint, so I can send Louis-Philippe the PowerPoint. I don't know if you're going to post the video, but if you do so, you can post my PowerPoint. I did write early on that if the Great Recession brought back Keynes, meaning by Keynes simply countercyclical fiscal policy, which had sort of vanished. In all fairness, that if you think of the previous recessions, that nobody really even talked about that. And we do have people like Blanchard talking about it's okay to spend, and debt to the GDP ratios are not, even if they go up, is fine because we're on the right side of RG. So mainstream economics rediscovered Omar, which is in all fairness good. But And what I suggested is, I think this crisis will bring back socialism. And by socialism, I meant, and I cited the war. I said the war is the model to think about this. But what I meant is planning. So I didn't mean, as I say there in the PowerPoint, I didn't mean a social democracy. So I don't think things are going to get necessarily better for people at large. There's no Soviet Union. There's no alternative model. So that was the thing that actually pushed, to a great extent, the benefits for the working class in the advanced world. So the golden age was possible to a great extent because of that. So there is nothing in the horizon like that. So that's not what I meant. What I meant is that I do believe that when this crisis goes through, and I'm saying I think we're at the beginning of this. So this crisis will go until 2022. In my simple simulation, to help me think, in which I say that the two things is unemployment will be with us for a long period, for a decade, and that public debt will go up significantly. On this, I don't think anybody can really think Mario's right. Private debt cannot go up. It doesn't go up in recessions. It goes down. So the only thing that can go up is public debt. It's a famous phrase from Mariner Eccles. It says, when you have a recession and private debts sort of collapse, you need something to go up, and those will be, it's inevitable. So they will go up, and it will go up. So that's I might be wrong. You come back in a few years and tell Matias, you're an idiot, you were wrong. So it very often is the case. My point is, what I'm saying is, it has to. There is no other alternative in these circumstances. So those two things I think will happen. It doesn't mean that that in this context, when those things do happen, that we're going to have an economy that necessarily works better for the people. But I do think so. There are certain things that I think are important to understand the dynamics, in particular in the U.S., and we can think of U.S. relevant globally. So I'm here going to bring, and I'll shut up with this, a concept that I think it's extremely relevant, has not been used as much as it should in the economics literature, because we don't pay attention in economics to anything that it's soft thinking. So the idea of the predator state. So John Kenneth Galbraith talks about the new industrial state, the bureaucratic sort of state that was controlled with the techno bureaucracy and the big corporations, control and basically produce some sort of degree of planning, if you want, even in the so-called market economies. So in many ways, what Jamie, his son, has done with a little book called The Predator State is to suggest that model had sort of come down, that what you had with the neoliberal sort of version of capitalism in the last 40 years is a state in which the elites and the corporations use the state, as we described, as Omar was describing, why is he getting loans from a bank rather than directly from the government? Is that corporations are used to enrich 1% individuals, so that there is a predating on the general public, and the state is the instrument by what it the way that is done. But I think that has to be added and cope with the idea that Fred Block and other sociologists have talked about, a hidden developmental state. So in the US, you will have that, I think, for security reasons, because the US is in a hegemonic confrontation with China. There'll be some understanding that a certain degree of planning on health is necessary. So the US will not depend on not only on 5G from China, but it will not depend on health issues from China. So if there is a vaccine, the US will make sure that it's available with just domestic sources. There are plenty of other resources that are important, rare materials, and there are many other things that but I think on health this will sort of have an impact. So I think that the US will the hidden developmental state here will be relevant, not just to prop defense and military companies, but now we'll have a military health industrial complex. And so that doesn't necessarily mean better health for the public in general, but the United States armed forces will have to have some sort of degree of control of what goes on in there. And what that, to me, that it's connected with the predator state is that at the same time we'll have these levels of and things that already existed in the US of a failed state. So the US is in many ways a failed state, like in many cases I suggested Latin America. We already had before this crisis. We had that kids that cannot pay, they're off their parents' insurance, middle class kids that are off their parents' insurance and cannot pay for for their insulin. They die. They ration insulin and they die. That happens in a third world country, and that happens in the US. And so those two things will sort of probably be part of what we'll get. So we're going to get some degree of planning and socialism and war economy, I think, but it will be selective, it will be hidden, it will not be for everybody. And the model for that, it's a very neoliberal model. It's the fascist Pinochet regime. So the Pinochet regime was the first neoliberal regime. It was pro-market, and it delivered. If you go to Chile, one of the worst levels of of social indicators. And whatever remains that it's good, I should say, it's because of the previous 30 years of developmental welfare state. So that survives, and that it's the same in the US. Some things will survive, but for the most part, what we're going to get is the predator state and a failed state for the vast majority, and a planning, developmental state for the few. Those are my more than 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you, Matias. I have a few comments off the bat. First of all, regarding my haircut, Matias, you are an idiot. You are wrong. Your words, not mine. Anyways, joking aside, I do have a couple of serious questions. First of all, I agree, and I've always said that the real crisis is about to begin. And this is linked to why I think the Austerians will take power again and will impose these drastic cuts. And we'll have to deal with the real economic crisis. We've seen right now this COVID crisis is nothing compared, I think, to what's coming. Second of all, I'm not sure about the socialism thing, mainly because, in my opinion, that would require some sort of a shift in societal power structure away from finance, which I just don't see that at all. And in my opinion, especially if Austerians dominate the discourse over policy, which I think they will, I think you're just going to have more of the same that we've had. That's my opinion. I don't know if you have an opinion on that.
Louis-Philippe?
Yes.
Can I intervene?
No, but I just
By
want.
all means, yes. You want me to respond? I can respond. If it's over, if it's on the same direction, by all means, I think it's.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. That's fine. Yeah.
Well, so all of this, my reply to that, all of this depends on how you define things. So I don't know if you saw the thing. What I meant is real socialism. So real socialism is what? It's it's the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union. By the way, so certain things. I don't think. For example, Mario, you said a couple of things that I may say on this. Given that I don't think that what we will see if we gave, which I'm not. I agree with Mario. I don't think we're going to be generous, and we can talk about UBIs versus employment guarantees and so on and so forth, and advantages and disadvantages, and the importance of full employment. But I don't think we're going to get the disincentives of the neoclassical theory. I think what we get is the Janos Kornai shortage economy. What we need to read again, it's a Soviet system. So we're going to get shortages on certain things, and I think that's possible. We're going to get shortages. I mean, we did get shortages, and we got used to, toilet paper shortage versus, whatever. And we're going to have different ones as things sort of evolve. So I think that's an important sort of element of this. So a little bit depends on what you mean by socialism. So what I'm saying is we're going to have socialism planning and guaranteeing that certain things are not missing for certain groups. And those groups, of course, are beyond the ones at the top that, they decide they're consuming way less and they're fine. But also, for the corporations and what corporations are relevant to keep the United States. I mean, look, with all the talk that the United States in decadence, in the vast majority of sectors that matter, including the ones that, we're all in Zoom. In the vast majority of companies that matters in the key sectors, the U.S. is still, the leading sort of, I mean, there is a challenge, no doubt, but the U.S. is sort of still central. And so to forget the hidden developmental state that Fred Bloch talks, it's a dangerous thing. At the same time, I do agree with you because, what you're saying is it's going to be crappy, yes, there'll be austerity, but the austerity will be for everybody. They'll cut the benefits and so people will be, in terrible situation. My phrase to that is somebody said, oh, the United States is in decadence. I think not. I mean, American industry, is relatively well. Who is really doing poorly? It's the American working class, particularly blue collar working in manufacturing. Those are in terrible shape. And you can take a lot of the populism stuff that came from that. So the duality that, I don't know who cited that. Mario cited that the duality, maybe Tom, the Peter Tamin sort of book. So I think that duality is at the core, not just of what happened in society that you have, but on how the state behaves. There is a hidden developmental state for the wealthy and the corporations. And there is a failed state or a predator state for the rest. That can go and should go hand in hand with a lot of financialization. I mean, it's how the elites keep. I mean, the elites keep their money outside of the country. Look, the two last Republican candidates, Romney gave us 2 years of his taxes. His father back in the 60s gave us 12 years of his taxes. You know why? Because he lined his ducks in order to be able to show in 2 years that he actually paid some taxes. Trump doesn't show it. Could be a bunch of things. He's not a billionaire, but also because he doesn't pay taxes probably, and so so that's the story. So they they don't participate in society in the ways they, the rest do. And the financial sector is central for that. So I don't think that they're incompatible things. So I think, you can have both things at the same time.
Okay, thank you. We'll just take one question because we really have to move along. Who has a question? Omar?
Yes. Can I intervene?
Yes, please.
Well, first of all, Louis-Philippe, I think we should probably plan another meeting 2 years from now, so we can check on his predictions. Second, I think your point on socialism is well taken, and you see I think you made, Matias, you made really interesting analysis with all your diagram. Unfortunately, toward the end, you just diverted into opinions, rather speculation, rather than opinion of what's going to happen to the economy, let's say, next year or the year after. Of course, I mean, you made two interesting points. One is the type of economy that we have today, which relies that 45% of the economy is in the service industry. Now, all of us can pay 2,000 or 3,000 to go on ship trip around the world, and very little people would pay more than $2 or $3 for my letters. So that's where the money is. It's not in the farming or in the industry, or the money is in the service industry. Now, if the monetary authority floods the market with liquidity through the banking system, they can just give money, lend the money, give the, how do they call them? Loan to consumption. Within a couple of months, if we open up the borders, people will start flying, they start, going on vacation, and then the economy will get back to on its feet. With the cost, of course, of what that's going to do to the pollution, that's going to do the resources, I think the problem is finance. Socialization, your socialism, maybe you should turn it into what Mario was suggesting, is the socialization of the investment that Keynes has proposed. Socialization of the investment or capital that Keynes suggested, he was talking about.
I wasn't making a proposal, so let me just
interrupt
something
here. Omar, Matias has to leave in literally a few minutes, so let's end your question here. I apologize, and give Matias a last word. Maybe
I didn't make my point. You wouldn't know where I'm trying to get to. The reform is the banking system. The money is a public good. It shouldn't be in the hand of the banking system. The banking system should get out of the speculation. It should be doing banking operation. They should be lending short. They shouldn't be lending into. They shouldn't get into speculation in the housing market or in mass entertainment or mass tourism or mass. So if we reform the system, you don't have to nationalize it. Just have rules like we used to have. If you control the banking system, you control the liquidity, you control where the money goes, you decide where the investment goes. I think those are the direction in which we should think. I'm not saying that it is the only solution, but it is a major solution. It's the banking system, is the way we use liquidity, is the way we let liquidity in the hands of speculators, which are not interested in the well-being of a nation, but they're taking advantage for their own sake. I mean, that's the problem. So sorry, I'm taking too much time. Okay, Louis-Philippe, that's fine.
Thank you, Matias. Last word.
So let me say thank you, Omar, for the comments. And I see, I don't know if, well, the question there, I think, was for somebody else. So I was reading the chat question. So first of all, I'm not suggesting socialism or what I suggested as a proposal. So I have zero interest in utopian proposals. So I think that they're relevant. I had this conversation with Jane Darista for a long while. So I think they're relevant and important. I'm saying I personally, I'm not I do believe, again, with John Kenneth Galbraith, if that what separates good economics and bad economics is a sense of history. And so what I'm trying to think is, what will happen. So I do think that, again, don't get necessarily bogged down with my use of the word socialism. I meant it not in the way, I meant that we're moving to a world in which we have less reliance on markets for certain things, and that planning, as much as protectionism or some intervention in the arena of trade are coming. So whether we get a Trump or we get Biden, so notice that nobody in the Democratic Party, when they have to talk about China and trade, they're treading on on difficult sort of waters, because they don't know exactly what to say. And they know that back in 2016, Trump was on the left on issues of NAFTA and whatnot. Not that he did anything about that. That's a perfectly reasonable discussion to have. So I didn't mean socialism in the sense that I would love to get whatever you people say the revenge of the the euthanasia of the rentier, and sort of get a world in which finance does less, and so on and so forth. But in all fairness, financial markets were always, from inception, back when, so when you create, Bank of England, humongous amounts of debt and whatnot, we have bubbles, South Sea bubble and so on and so forth. So that's what financial markets do. They were very, seldom tamed by the state. They were tamed in the period of so-called Bretton Woods, again, a period in which we had the Soviet Union. Even by the end of that period, it's porous and complicated. So the notion that we're going to stop that kind of stuff seems to me, in the current context, even with all of the interesting sort of revolts that are around, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, people in the streets, I find it difficult to believe that we're going to have, that kind of solution. So what I was pointing out is that I do think that this is, with all the uncertainty, a long-term crisis, that the long-term crisis will require the state. I think that's my prediction. So that the size of that will have to go up. That the private sector, as Mario said, is not going to do that. That's why I said I'm really agreeing with Mario on this, saying exactly the same thing. I think that the kinds of things that Mario is suggesting would be great, but I don't think that they will happen. And what I do think will happen is that the U.S. state, because there is an apparatus, even behind the clown that is the current president in the United States, and there is a state apparatus, and that state apparatus already has been working in certain directions. So there is an industrial, military, financial complex, and I think that some of the elements of the health issue and the preparedness for pandemics, I'm pretty sure the Pentagon is thinking on these things. And so that will come as part of how the hidden developmental state behaves, with problems. I'm not saying that the developmental state is perfect and will get everything right, but that will be part of what will happen. So that's what I call the part that it's socialism. For the rest, it's the market. So for the rest, we got the failed state, the predator state of Jamie. And so I think we're going to have lots of. Hopefully I'm wrong. I want to be wrong. I think we're going to get lots of deaths. I think we're not going to solve the things in the best possible way. We didn't talk here. I read what's the meaning of that for Latin America and developing countries, in which the health systems are even less prepared, in which we do not have sovereign currencies, in which several countries are going to default under that. Argentina at this point is having very difficult situation in negotiating with external banks. We're already in default. We might be officially with Elliott cited by it's not one of the main ones, but remember, it's one of the vulture funds. So those things will happen. There'll be a significant collapse of sovereign debt around the globe. The amount of money the IMF has in hands, it's ridiculous. It's not enough to hold, to fill a little hole of what's coming. And as I said, there is a significant amount of corporate debt in the United States, non-financial corporate debt. It's not just banks. It's the big thing over the last 10 years. It's what's been happening with non-financial corporations. The amount of junk bonds and debt that there is around, it's brutal. And so that's still all coming. So that's why I said it's going to be terrible. I do apologize. This is a good conversation. I do enjoy and I do support an idea of further conversations. I'm already late for my class. In Latin American fashion, I'll be late for my own class. So I'll see you all guys, pretty soon. And thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Matias. Thank you very much. Okay, so now we move to our last speaker today, Anna Maria Variato from Italy, the University of Bergamo. And Anna Maria, you have the floor.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello. Thank you for the invitation. Well, I'm not very optimistic, and maybe my position is especially given by the very fact that I'm Italian and I'm sitting exactly in the middle, at the core of the crisis. And so, in some sense, it's quite easy not to be extremely positive about the future. Well, I think that after all the speeches today, I will try to be as short as possible. And my apologies if I sound a little bit too naive. But I want to be some kind of didascalic and very general, not focused on specific issues, because all the other speakers, they spent a lot of time on these aspects. Now, so I give you my perception about this debate. I think that the first observation that I can make is that let's say, if we look at the last, let's say, 40 years of economics, we may say that the focus have changed, but the strategy always doesn't. What I mean with this with the observation, I think that economists in general, and here I do not make any difference between mainstream or heterodox. In the last years, they have moved more or less always moving, reacting to contextual stresses, and rather than in terms of visionary anticipation of what will happen. What I mean, I'm saying that economists are increasingly focusing on the issue of the day. So if the issue is globalization, they talk about globalization. If the issue is financial liberalization, they debate on financial liberalization. Then they move to financial stability, to financial sustainability of sovereign debt, and then now they move to COVID reaction, as it is the news of the day is the policies against this new issue, but there's no vision in anticipation. And so nowadays, today we are talking about the COVID prosperity measures, after COVID prosperity measures. But 10 years ago, we should have said the same about subprime crisis. And so a similar seminar would have been held. What can we do in order to face the crisis after subprime? Nothing has changed, more or less, because we always react after, and without building a real new alternative paradigm. Is it clear that it's easy to criticize mainstream, and all we are heterodox, and so it's easy in this place to say, well, what we want to address. Of course, we can recognize that the focus on exogenous shocks, on temporary shocks, the focus on supply side economics is wrong from the perspective of heterodox economics. We can object, for example, that the focus on firms and investment is not enough. So the mainstream measures suggested in order to foster the recovery of the economy, where enterprises and research are the key of the expenditure in mainstream terms, we can object and we may say, no, it is not firms and investment that we have to focus on, but we have to take into account labor and aggregate demand. We have to take into account not market, but distribution of income as being heterodox. It's easy to make to make point by point the opposite to mainstream, and we may go on and on. And also the methods can be addressed, and so we may say, instead of using very detailed mathematical objective methods, we want to move to other kind of methods, but still mathematics, and so on. So as a synthesis, we may say that in general, even though heterodox approach has different attitudes to specific issues, I think that we can agree with the fact that mainstream failed to make the system around the world to recover steadily and consistently after the waves of financial crisis that we had in the last years. And now maybe the same measures are going to fail in order to face the next crisis that we are going to face, because basically the economic paradigm that we trust upon in mainstream is a failure paradigm. And this failure paradigm is due to the fact that we suggest to economic policy the wrong policies. So I think that everybody in this room, more or less, I think is going to agree to the fact that it was even if there was an exogenous accident like COVID, the persistence of the crisis is not due to the exogenous shock, but is due mainly to the fact that we do not adopt the correct measures in order to get rid of this shock. And why we don't? Because not only because mainstream stays there, but also because heterodox people does not come to a synthesis, does not come to a real alternative to this mainstream approach. And this this alternative is not supposed to be just the opposite. And so if a mainstream guy says, I want to focus to exogenous, then I have to focus on endogenous. If a neoclassical guy says the focus is on aggregate supply, then you have to say the opposite, aggregate demand. And so this is not the kind of the game that we are supposed to play. Because at the very beginning, as soon as you say that you recognize that the nature of a capitalistic system is endogenously unstable, then from the very beginning, you say that you have to face all these issues all together with a model of complexity, with a model in which you do not face partial issues. You don't face things one point by one point, but you build an overall model of macroeconomics, which is not something which recalls the past. Because we are in the year 2020. We need to face history and the systems as they are now. We are not supposed to reproduce what has happened in the past. We have to be able to build a vision for the future. But this kind of vision, we do not suggest the need of this kind of vision. So we spend time making forecasts, giving numbers on specific issues. But these numbers more basically are useless because they are the effect of partial derivatives, let's say so. They are partial answers or partial models. Instead, we need general models. We need to be able to be cooperative and dialectic in saying, well, we do not have answers, we do not have forecast, but we have to be able to create the effort for being able to create such visions, to give students, to give politicians these instruments. And I don't hear these issues as being the real issues that we have to face as economists. And this is my plea. I'm afraid that in the short run, we will not get rid of the mainstream. I'm afraid as an Italian that we won't be able to get rid of austerity. I'm afraid that as Italian, we will not see any kind of good in the economic policy. I think that our country will be, let's say, residual. And I think that in part, this responsibility comes from economists in some sense, because they, in some sense, they renounced to be the soul and of this idea of building a new idea for future. They spent all time saying, would it be socialism? Would it be money? Would it be finance? I don't care about the labels. I want to have solutions. I want to think, let's say we have a complex issue in front of us, and we need to use our intellect, all the ideas that we shared in these things, and to summarize them into an alternative paradigm, into alternative visions that speak to each other. I just make an example. I don't think, let's say a pedagogical example. If we take, let's say, the ISLM model, as a Keynesian, I don't like this model in the sense that I don't think that this model is truly Keynesian. But I think that this model is extremely powerful, because at some point in the history of economic thought, this model was used in order to give a pedagogical example to students. Through this model, students can understand how alternative paradigm can be compared. Through ISLM model, we can understand very easily, not exactly, but the difference among being a neoclassical guy or a Keynesian guy. Because the IS behind Keynesians is absolutely different from the IS behind the neoclassical. And you can understand the difference easily from the very elementary level. In this way, through this model, you can say, you teach to students how to compare alternative models. This model is inadequate to nowadays conditions. So we need to build a new pedagogical model in which we are able to create a common methodological ground through which alternative visions can be compared. And only through this way, we can say, okay, the suggestion that we give for the economic policy is this one, it is this one. Basic income, taxation, money, banking control, these are just the effects of the hypothesis inside the basic model, but without a model, a complex interactive model of the new reality that we have, we are not able to give meaningful answers. And without meaningful answers, we are useless. And so I think that we take back this responsibility. If we take back the fact that we go out and we say we want to defend the vision because we are people of visions. We do not give numbers. You know, give numbers. In Italian, to give numbers means to be crazy. It's the equivalent. If you give numbers, it gives that you are crazy. It says if you say dai I numeri, it's equivalent to be crazy. But there is one point: the cultural meaning of to give numbers is people was giving numbers in order to forecast the future. So giving numbers is related to Kabbalah and to the ability to be able to interpret the future. Obviously, we do not try dice. We do not want to give numbers in this way, because usually these kind of people are liars. I think that as a scientist, we want to be able to have the visions, which is something different. It is because there's no future. We are, I think, as a heterodox, we are different from mainstream because we do not believe that outside there is something already settled. We think that the world needs to be built. We do not discover laws. We build the laws. And so we have this fantastic responsibility. And this responsibility needs, I think, a long-run view, and needs that we are able to make this synthesis starting from this effort. I conclude saying that the very first book that I have read in my life, I was 14, and so I just went into this book just by chance. I was 14, first year of high school was Schumpeter, Capitalism, Democracy, so Capitalism, Socialism, Democracy. My dream for myself, I wanted to become a veterinary. So when I was 14, if you asked me, what do you think about Schumpeter book? You say, oh, difficult, but I want to be a vet. Who cares? After 40 years, I know that I was not a vet. I became an economist. I understood that most of the things that I've read do not happen as I've studied. And so I don't know whether capitalism is doomed to failure. Capitalism is doomed to transform into socialism or into a democracy. I don't know. But in some sense, I never became a vet. But happily, after crisis, I became a very happy economist. In the same way, I think that in some sense, step by step, we build, even for the future of macroeconomics, these issues. And so I'm saying, well, let's think more seriously on the way in which we face the big picture, because the big picture, the visions are disappearing day after day from economics. And this is the very first important thing of consciousness that we have to safeguard, because in the short run, I'm afraid that we are not able to face the crisis and to get rid of it through a mainstream dialogue. Maybe I'm a little bit too pessimistic, but and maybe this is the result of the experience of being in this country in this period and in many other years before this talk. Okay, so sorry for this. I'm done.
Thank you, Anna Maria. Very emotional and very insightful comments. We are running a little bit behind, and so in order to end soon, I'm going to put Mario on the spot. And since his journal is hosting this seminar today, maybe I can give Mario the last word, maybe a 5-minute comment on what Anna Maria said just now. Mario?
Yeah, you do put me on the spot here, but I'll try to deliver what I can here. Anna Maria, I appreciate the points that you raised. However, we are struggling to see how we can get out of this crisis. And there are certain issues that need to be addressed at that level. We know it's also a problem of theory in the sense that models that we have of the world, whether it's mainstream or heterodox, a lot of these models help, but a lot of them don't help at all as well. So it depends which one we can be a little more, how should I say, selective in the way in which we will address issues that are clearly outstanding right now. And the issues that are outstanding right now, the way I was saying it earlier, was that we have an economy, a world economy, that is not only in deep, deep crisis, but an economy which I don't believe is going to be as simple. It's more like a, what do you want to call, an L-shaped, the way I see it, than a V-shaped kind of recovery, unless, something is done. And therefore, the whole question is not just, obviously it's important to understand the theory that one professes in order to be able to have some coherence and consistency in the way you're able to address these issues. But at the same time, one must look for some sort of, how should I say, way to ultimately get out of this mess. And what I found missing in all your discussion was exactly that. Is there, you said you're negative about it. I completely understand. I'm negative about it. Also, I'm very depressed in the sense of seeing what is happening right now. It's extremely depressing. But at the same time, I do find that there has come a certain level of consciousness. And I would say that not just among heterodox economists who see some of this, but even some of the mainstream people that I've talked to, there's more awareness about certain things that were not there before. We cannot be oblivious to what's going on and completely have inconsistent understanding of reality around us. So clearly, as I said, even some of these mainstream people have to be able to, at some point come to some sense of consciousness in what is going on out there and how it can be ultimately addressed. And when we find, for instance, that even though we have deficits that are exploding, nothing is happening on interest rate, all the stories about the sky falling, none of that is happening. So obviously, whoever professes these theories, as an example, I'm giving that here, any area I could almost think of. When we look at how these theories, how they profess and suggest that there should be a different way of looking at the world, and we have to come to that consciousness, which I think is not quite there for a lot of people, but it is, I see it more and more. Now, so that's the positive side, but even there, it's as I said, it's depressing, because when you actually look at policy here, when you listen to politicians especially, how can you not be depressed? This is
exactly.
Yeah, but honestly, what I think is missing is how do we get out of this? Is there anything you offer? At that level? Yeah.
Oh, so you ask me, is anything you offer? I'm afraid that I cannot. My answer is exactly related to my own experience. I'm one of those who put her hands in the dirty things. So I was sitting in the banks. I was in the board of a bank. I was also trying to suggest, working on suggesting in the shadows measures for policies, but they didn't want to hear. And and even in the bank, I was kicked off. So from the pragmatic point of view, they do not listen. And why they do not listen? Well, because, for example, in the bank, when I say, I was going there, for example, let's say, take into the account the risk, change the shape of the measure of risk, the forecast future of the risk for the portfolio in order to avoid the failure or not performing loans. Right? They didn't want to change because this was not the standard way in which the measures, the risk measurement was done. And I'm sure that they will end up with new failures. So the point is, I am a pragmatic person. That's the point. Even though I'm making big discourses, in the specific issues, I suggest measures for specific. But the answer is go away. and so in this aspect, what is the point? Of course, I may say, for example, if you say basic income, I would prefer to create jobs instead of income. I would prefer to pay for people making specific jobs instead of giving basic income. As like let's say employer of last resort. But so we can talk about the specific measures, but I think in some sense it is a sort of I mean, to me is a sort of pointless in the sense that I don't see people around me which are ready to listen to a serious project of specific because I don't think that you can say general measures. I don't think that the measures for Italy, for Lombardy are the same that Italy and Sicily or France or Germany. I don't think. I think that in order to recover from this crisis, we need to be very specific to the context. And so to be very pragmatic with respect to the context.
Thank you very much, Anna Maria. Unfortunately, this brings to the end this very, I'm sure we could all go on for a couple more hours. I think time is the only true constraint. And well, thank you very much, everyone. Tom, Mario, Anna Maria, and of course, Matias. Thank you, everyone, for joining in. There were close to 50 participants at one time. So thank you very much. Maybe we should revisit the question in 6 months and see what happens then. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, LP. Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you for the invitation. Bye-bye.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.